Hi there. Today's lecture is for week 10, and there are a good number of supplemental readings that I also want you to do this week, but I just wanted to introduce you to some of the main issues that arise in the later part of the 1980s and the early 1990s when there is a clash between the National Endowment for the Arts, well, not directly between the NEA and anybody, but artists who are funded by the NEA who come to the attention the of certain more conservative members of Congress who become upset with the idea that these particular artists have been funded by taxpayer money. And this controversy actually swirls around several different artists. There are two that we're going to look at, but there are more that become part of a big. There's a group called the NEA4, which includes the performance artist Karen Finley, that basically have a court case where they are suing the government because the NEA had withdrawn funding from them after they became or after they were under sort of political attack, and there's this whole battle that goes on through the court system as well as in the congressional record and in public um, in public debate over whether or not the government should fund the arts, and if so, if there should be certain controls on what kind of art gets funded. So there's this kind of interesting moment when there is a great deal of political interest in what's going on in the art world, particularly because the NEA had been funding art projects, and then as the art world as art was moving in certain directions, dealing with things like identity and whatnot, as you'll see, this becomes a kind of flashpoint for controversy. This period sometimes gets known as the culture wars period because there is so much political attention being paid to what is going on in the art world. We are going to look really at two figures who were centerpieces in this controversy: Andres Serrano and Robert Mapplethorpe, two photographers. I will warn you that in this lecture there are several very explicit and blasphemous and graphic images. So please, if you have sensitive stomach, or if you are, well, I don't know, not a sensitive stomach, but I mean, if you are in a kind of, at work or whatever, I mean, this is not safe for work kind of lecture. So just be prepared. You're going to see a couple of, rather explicit images in this lecture. In fact, that's why these images became the subject of controversy. All right, so let's go ahead and start looking with this image by Andres Serrano. This is a 1987 photograph from a series that Serrano was doing in the later 1980s. As you can see, it is a crucifix in this very kind of rich and luxuriant looking reddish, orangish, yellowish environment. The title of this work is actually Piss Christ from 1987. It's a very large print, Cibachrome print. It is a crucifix that has been placed in, it's a close-up of a crucifix that has been suspended in a jar of Andres Serrano's urine, hence the name Piss Christ. Now, if you saw this image and you didn't know the title, it may just look like a very beautiful kind of luminous image. Of course, once you know the title and once you know the context of what this image is, how this image is created, that is when this became the flashpoint for a great deal of controversy. Serrano, in this series, the bloodwork series that he was doing, where he was using his own body fluids in order to, as the subject of photographs, and I've got several of them that I can show you here in this lecture. Once it became known that that's what this substance was, of course, then it became controversial. Serrano had gotten a nice NEA grant in order to pursue this series. He was an up-and-coming photographer. When Senator Jesse Helms, who was a conservative senator from North Carolina, discovered this had been funded by the taxpayers, he initiated a congressional hearing on the subject of the NEA. And it was this photographer and Robert Mapplethorpe that Helms brought to the Congress to talk about questions of the taxpayer, whether the taxpayer should pay for this kind of stuff, questions of obscenity and morality and pornography, all sort of swirled around the images that I'm showing you today. And, when do you draw the line between art and pornography, art and blasphemy. Um, is the government obligated to pay for art even if tax-paying public doesn't understand or like the art? These are all questions that arose from this culture wars controversy of the 1980s. And in Blackboard, I've got some readings for you to do, an interview with Andres Serrano, and some excerpts of things that were read into the congressional record by some of these senators during this hearing period, where different issues are being raised that I think are worth thinking about even today. Here's another example from this series that Serrano is doing. As you can see, it's just a little plastic statue of the Virgin and Child, then also subsumed in a jar of urine. One of the things that Serrano said in his own defense, by the way, and let me go back here to Piss Christ. One of the things that Serrano said to explain what he was doing here is, and ways that this has been talked about and interpreted. Serrano himself is Catholic, and he said he feels that, he's not doing, he has a reverence for, or at least he claims that he has a reverence for Catholic symbols. Now, there are some things that you can think about when you're looking at Piss Christ. I mean, yes, on one hand, it is a crucifix in urine, but on the other hand, you can think about what crucifixion actually is. And if you've ever read up on it or ever learned about it, crucifixion is a very body fluid, intense process. Not to gross you out or anything, but I mean, you're talking about a person sweating and bleeding, and as they lose control of and nerve function, there is also excrement and urine as the body is going through this period of suffering. It's a very intense and degrading process. I mean, that's why the Romans wanted to crucify Christ. And so in one way, this Piss Christ is tapping into that idea of the human and physical and bodily suffering that goes on with crucifixion. Serrano himself said in one interview that I read, what I'm doing is making a commentary on all the people who really defile the image of Christ. And in the 80s, he was pointing fingers at the televangelists who would get on TV and tell people they needed to send in money, to that particular televangelist in order to praise God. And Serrano said that was a much more defiling of the name of Christ, or of the idea of God, than anything he was doing. So there's a couple of different interpretations that I'm offering you of Piss Christ beyond the just, well, this is shocking and blasphemous, right? Ecce Homo, another of his series, the body fluid series, and there again it's a statue of Jesus. And I'm showing you, this is the photograph, the large scale photograph as it's mounted in a frame. This is also from the body fluid series. This is literally just the materials that he that collected, piss and blood here, turned into these beautiful, very richly colored, very tonally dense, large-scale, abstract-looking photographs. Serrano, when he's doing this, by the way, keep in mind that this is at the height of the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, when there is a lot of focus on the blood supply in America, and the ways in which body fluids could transmit that particular disease. So it may be hard to recapture that mentality now 20 years later, but that's part of what's going on here. And blood and body fluids as a subject for an artist's work had a particularly cutting edge kind of currency at that time. Blood and Soil from 1987, and here again this is Serrano turning this into just beautiful abstract texture, but obviously with that title you know what the material is, so it takes on this different meaning. And I'm just going to page through a couple of these just to give you a sense of what his early work was looking like. And here, Untitled, obviously, this is, ejaculate and trajectory, so he's telling you this is what this actually is, right? So he did a whole series of these where he would pleasure himself and then, capture the result as he could on camera and turn them into these abstract compositions. This is what he was being funded for by the NEA, and this is, again, where you're going to have the interests of the art world and some of the ideas that we've been talking about all semester, that it's, the artist's idea that makes a work of art and things like that, are going to come up against the hard reality of conservative taxpayers. Serrano also did a series of Catholic imagery. He was raised Catholic, and talks even now. And as you'll see in that image, shooting, or in that interview, shooting the Klan, he talks about his um, strong, strong sort of identification with the Catholic Church. But here, obviously, he's got somebody dressed up to look like a cardinal, and then you've got this bare-breasted, chain or naked woman who's being hung up, and then obviously has been abused and whipped. Very kind of implied sadomasochistic sexuality, very sensual or sexual image. Um, that perhaps by inference or implication is, connecting the church and the abuse of the authority to this kind of stuff. Serrano was very coy about this, and he would often say, well, this is really what you're reading into it. That's not my intent, or, talking about the kind of religious ecstasy and flagellants. And these are, people in the Middle Ages would actually, especially in plague years, they would march, and actually pilgrims would do this too. They would carry whips with them and flail themselves with whips as a kind of prayer and penance. This was something that was encouraged by the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. So he would argue that he was kind of tapping into a long tradition of the Catholic Church, but I think you can probably take up an argument with Serrano on that. But here, I'm bringing this in to show you because I think you can see how this would be the kind of imagery that some people would take offense to. And I just wanted to show you, too, that he has continued to do a provocative series. In this series, the Morgue series, which was done in the early 90s, Serrano actually got permission to go into a morgue and photograph the bodies as they came through the morgue to do. And actually, in this series, the series is technically very, very well executed, very beautiful in some ways, and it's taking this tragic and ugly part of life and turning it into something beautiful that seems to be the subject of this particular series by Serrano. But again, I think what's interesting here is that you can also see how some people would be offended by a picture like this. This is a photograph of a close-up photograph of a child who has, as you can see, died after drowning. Okay, developed pneumonia after being submerged in the water, and so even though without that title you really wouldn't know whether this was a a dead body, right? There's a kind of tension that's created here, beauty and tragedy. Something that's horrific to look at turned into something that's really, in a way, quite beautiful. There are a couple of these. This is another of that same drowning victim. Okay. And then I've got another one here, meningitis, I think. Yeah, fatal meningitis 2 from the Morgue series. Here again, if you didn't know the title, you wouldn't know. You would assume this was a sleeping child. This also, by the way, taps into a hugely long tradition in photography of postmortem photography of children, especially in America, especially in the 19th century when child mortality was really quite high. After photography was introduced as a technology, more and more families, if they suffered the tragic loss of a child, would actually have a photographer take a photograph of the baby or child, sometimes a family photograph or the mom holding the baby or child, as a commemoration before they buried the baby or the child. So he's tapping into a long tradition here, a long photographic tradition as well. But again, for the uninitiated public, right, who are just taxpayers and don't particularly know or care about contemporary art, they may not see such a thing in that context. And that is where I think the root of the trouble was for Serrano in the 1980s. And it was at the center of this debate, this NEA debate, the debate about whether or not the government should be charged with funding artists, and if so, who should choose which artists get the funding? That was at the heart of the issue. Do art experts get to choose, or should the lay public get to choose? If art experts choose, are they going to choose stuff like this that offends the regular taxpayer? If lay people choose, are they going to choose stuff that wouldn't be of high enough quality for the opinion of art experts? So that, that's a kind of part of I think, an ongoing question or problem or tension in art now, which is that it has become a specialized community. It has become a somewhat insulated community that is largely showing in either galleries in New York or galleries on the West Coast or galleries in Beijing, in London, and other of the major contemporary art centers. And does it get too removed from people for regular folks to get this stuff? That's an ongoing kind of problem or question.